Welcome to Meet the Author. I'm Guy Morris with the Author Event Network, and tonight we have an amazing memoir writer with us named Tamara Sellman, and I'm so excited to talk to Tamara. She has an amazing personal story to share with you. Welcome, Tamara. How are you?
I'm doing great. How about you?
I'm doing wonderful. So glad to have you. Thank you for coming.
Glad to be here.
Well, Tamara, I want to start with, you've got a unique memoir and a story to tell. Tell us about your book, Tremor, Intention Tremor, and why you decided to write the book.
Oh, okay. Well, like a lot of books, authors with books, we write our story because we have a unique experience and we want to share it with people. And my unique experience was that one day I was cracking open a giant textbook to study for a finals exam for sleep medicine I was studying for. And I cracked it open and I could see everything just fine, but I couldn't read. So I actually lost comprehension and I couldn't read. So I called up my doctor. He sent me over to an MRI across the parking lot up here in Paulsbo at the Bond Road, facility up there. And within 2 days' time, he called me back and said, I think you have multiple sclerosis.
Ouch.
Yeah, and I did eventually get my ability to read back, but it kind of comes and goes, and I also have issues with speech, too, which you might even hear while we're sitting here talking, which I don't care. I'm used to it and whatever. And so 5 weeks later, he referred me to a neurologist in Seattle. I got this chronic illness diagnosis of multiple sclerosis at age 48. Like, where did that come from? But it explained a lot of things. It explained a lot of symptoms I was having that never really collided at the same time. And so as a writer, I like to write to sort out things that I'm going through, right? I mean, it's a really healthy therapeutic thing, and I have absolutely no qualms doing that. A lot of people will say, oh, writing about, something as therapy is just not real writing. Oh, yes, it is. It's your research. It's what it is. So I started writing poetry, and I started writing essays, and I started looking for books that would tell me about living with multiple sclerosis, what it was like, not just the clinical things and the handouts and the things that doctors give you, but the real world, day-to-day living, the lived experience of people with this. And I really couldn't I found some really great memoirs, full-on prose memoirs, like Mitch Sturgeon's Enjoying the Ride. I think this is the name of his book. It's really good. But I didn't really find a lot in the way of like short essays or poetry. And so anyway, I'm writing, and I realized maybe I need to be the one that writes that book. Write the book that I haven't been able to find. That's sort of my heart as a human being, is to be in service to other people. And so here's my chance. I can use my writing to help other people. And so I processed 5 years of living with this illness and trying to figure out this new normal, really, that it left me with. And it's been a great journey, but it's also something I can share with other people. And the reaction has been pretty good, so.
Excellent. Well, then who are you really writing for? Are you writing for other people with MS, or are you writing for their families and friends, or a little bit of both?
That's a really good question. Initially, I was writing for myself, right? But then I'm taking myself kind of out of it and looking at it in terms of how other people are going to read it and what they can gain from it as a person with a chronic illness, specifically multiple sclerosis. But I talk about things like fatigue and taking a lot of pills and things that are sort of, universal for people with chronic illness. But I also think that this book would be great for anyone who is caring for another person with any chronic illness, to try to understand the interior life of someone who's going through that, because it's really hard to live in our culture and have disability, whether it's visible or not, have to deal with all these, side effects and symptoms, and then drug interactions and all the other things that come with, having to take medications and deal with the healthcare system, which is its own, talk about rabbit holes, we were talking about that earlier. So it's really kind of for everybody, but for anybody who is at all curious about what it is to live with multiple sclerosis or a chronic illness, not the disease itself so much as the day-to-day being a human being walking around with these things going on in your body.
Struggles
the emotional and the physical too, neurological, the speech, things like that.
Well, what kind of, other than your own personal experiences, do you do additional research? Do you interview others with the disease, or how have you really kind of encompassed that?
It's kind of funny. A couple of years in, I was invited. I was doing a little bit of blogging about it too. And a couple of years in, I was invited to have a column and write about day-to-day life. And that was, that appealed to me, and my background's in journalism. So I'm like, oh, I'm all over that. I would love to do that. And so I did that for Health Union, for the multiplesclerosis.net community for several, I think 7 years. And so I kind of turned it into that, and that forces you to do research because you're getting all of your work vetted. And of course, in my own poetry and even in my short prose pieces that I have in there, I use a lot of science. I mean, I come from a science family, and I was, a sleep technologist, so I have this sort of my own healthcare worker background. So I want to get it right. And as a journalist, I also want to get it right because there's so much misinformation out on the web, especially for health. And so I was always very cognizant of making, you can't make a claim, you have to substantiate everything, you have to corroborate everything, you have to have really solid resources. You can't, just take any website's word for it. There's some really bad websites out there.
I thought all 14.5 billion websites on the internet were all accurate.
Oh yeah, if it's on the internet, then it must be true, right?
Must be.
Jeez, it's so not. So I'm out there to try to be one of the good guys, basically, as a columnist. But of course, I approach that too as any kind of writing that I do, but especially in intention tremor. So
Interesting.
yeah.
Well, why did you choose a hybrid format with mixing poetry and your nonfiction? Tell me about that process or that thinking process.
Well, it initially was just a poetry book. And I had thought of it as what is called an abecedarian, which is each poem, there were going to be 26 poems, and each title would be a letter from the alphabet, and it would go from A to Z. And I did that, and then I realized that it wasn't capturing me as an entire person and writer. My first love is journalism and in fiction and prose writing. And I do like writing essay. And so there were some poems that just I didn't like, and I felt like they needed to be fleshed out as as some kind of prose piece. And so I took aside all the A to Z kind of planning, and I rethought the whole thing. I went to the coast, and I put all the poems out on the bed at this Airbnb, and I kind of reshuffled, and then I pulled some things out and I changed it around, and then it just became a better representation of me as a person. Because even though this is about multiple sclerosis and it's about, the healthcare and all this, it's also about me as a writer and me as a person and me processing. So I felt for it to be so personal, I needed it to really reflect who I am as a writer.
The other aspects of who you are other than a poet.
Yes, exactly.
Interesting.
Yeah.
When you sought publication, how did you go about that process? What kind of publishers did you look for? What was that? Because for authors, that's always one
really
of the
different.
most difficult part of the process in general. For something as unique as this, what was your process?
Yeah. So I went toward the small press because that's where you're going to find more places that publish poetry generally. And so I probably submitted it, I don't know how many places, probably 60 places before I found a publisher. And a lot of them were contests. There's just limited chance to get in. There's such a bottleneck of this many poets and this many publications, so the competition is really high. So you just have to keep sending it out and having some faith in it.
Yeah.
And then my publisher came along, Moonpath Press, who is run by Alana Ayers, who started it in Kingston, right up here, and was here for, I don't know, 15 years or more, maybe. The press itself is, I think, older than 20 years. Though she's not here anymore, but I submitted it to her, and she came back to me and she said, the world needs this book. And I was just like, thank you. I feel so too. And so that's kind of how but it took a lot of just sending it out and getting the rejection, sending it out again, knowing you're going against some really major big name poets in the same space, but you just keep trying.
Yeah, interesting. What other creative processes other than the book? What other creative processes or other adventures are you kind of exploring to kind of? I know you've got a mission to kind of get the story of MS out to the world in a more creative way, because I know we coming from someone who's on the outside, we hear about it from a celebrity here, celebrity there.
Sure.
We don't really hear much about it until they've deteriorated to some point, and then it's But what are you doing other than your books to kind of get that story out?
Well, I'm one of those people that has to be creative all the time, and so I don't always write every day, but I'm creating something. And so lately, I've been making these video collages, and I was inspired because I have a lot of peers in the MS community who have either auditory or hearing limitations or restrictions, or video or visual, and so they wanted an audio book or some other way to access my book.
Okay.
And okay, I could do an audio book and I could read it and stuff, and I probably do okay with that, but I feel like it's so personal and it's poetry, it needs to be performed. And so I thought, well, maybe I would be better off capturing the nature of this entire book from piece to piece as a video collage poem. So
interesting.
Yeah, so I went to the Engage Film Festival, which is here in Seattle.
What does that mean, a video collage poem?
It's basically a video or a film that has a poem sort of transferred onto it. You might even see the words on the screen. You might hear just the voiceover. You might have them both. It could be narrative live action. It could be animation. It could be a collage, which is what I do. I literally make these things in Canva.
Okay.
So and I'm taking some of my footage, but I'm also and even like sound effects. It was really windy last week, so I was recording the wind out of my cabin. I was on a retreat, and I was like standing by the door with my phone and getting some really good wind sounds. Yeah, and just putting it all together. And so this last week I did finish a poem film, really, and it is a film with some of my actual footage in there. And then I also made a little mini kind of music video that was just sort of a postcard from the Northwest to send to some of my friends as a practice, because you just got to get in the sandbox and just practice, and make things up. And it's so much fun. So I want to do that because I want people who are hearing impaired to be able to not only just have to read it, but they could actually see it come to life. And then people who are visually impaired could hear it, and then also have the sound effects and the music and the life that I want to be in that book. So
now, do you do your own editing as well?
For the video and all that? Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I do all of it. I'm just one of those people, and I have been a publisher in the past. I had a website, Margin, which was a magical realism magazine that I published for 10 years. So I'm kind of one of those people that likes to wear all the hats and just get my finger in all the different pies and just mash it up and see what happens. And it's really imperfect, and it's super gratifying.
So you're more worried about the message than the film expertise, or
well, I want it to have high production values as I can access, and that's why I'm taking classes in filmmaking now too. But I do have some good graphic design background from being a publisher and having done that, so that helps a lot. And I did design the cover myself, so the image.
It's a really gripping kind of color. It kind of captures attention. I know I've been in the booth with you where people really want to know what this is about because of the cover. And it's really hard to sell a book of poetry, it's really interesting to sit at those booths and have people come up, because you just don't know how many people at the fair are going to be poetry readers, and you're always surprised. I mean, you're always surprised at who comes by and who has a story that they share with you. I was inspired to do the poetry films because a hearing impaired person came up to our booth and said, is this an audiobook? And I said, no, and I don't know sign language, so I wrote them a note and said, I'm going to be making these poetry films, I think. And they're like, and they bought a copy. Excellent.
And I'm like, yeah, I mean, it's about making these connections with people. It's not about selling books. I mean, it is selling books because 100% of my proceeds go to a nonprofit. So it is about that. But it's not about selling books for me and my ego and everything. It's about getting information out for people so that they can make better sense of what's going on with MS, because most people, including myself, didn't know anything about it until I got it.
Well, I have to say, as somebody who works alongside you in the booth, that sometimes when you're selling it for charity, it makes the rest of us look a little bit greedy.
Well, writers are, we're all starving.
Yeah, we're
artists.
all starving authors. Yeah, we're all starving authors.
Yeah.
We have to have somebody supporting us.
Yes.
Well, between the books and the poetry and the film, do you have and dealing with your illness, do you have a process that you follow during the day? And do you like write at the same time? Do you work every day at this, or do you just basically have in spurts? Tell us about your process.
What I've learned with MS is that you just check in with yourself every day, check in with your energy, check in with your function, check in with your mood even. And you just go with that. And I always have a really long list of things I want to do, and I don't always get them all done, but I get a lot of them done. But it may not be in the order that I thought, and I might take everything that I wanted to do today, and I'll put it on Friday, and I'll take today's from Friday and do that instead. I just plug away. It's just like chipping away.
Okay.
That's kind of how I do. I'm creating something every day, definitely. If I'm not writing, I'm probably working on a little film thingy, or designing something, or making, marketing materials, or setting up to do a podcast. It's, there's some, creative process that goes into that, because you have to think about what you want to talk about and everything. So, every day it's very different. So I don't really have a static schedule. And I think my kids are grown, but I've been a writer my whole life, and I raised 2 children, and I worked all that time. So you just go with what you got at the time, and you don't really worry too much about a static schedule. You just go and just get it done however you can.
That's good. I think sometimes that flexibility is really important.
Yeah, I'm lucky to have it too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to know a little bit more about your podcast, because you mentioned that a couple times.
Oh, I don't do podcasts, but I go in and I am a guest on podcasts.
How do you find your guest spots for podcasts?
Well,
I know a lot of authors would love to be interviewed on podcasts. How do you go about finding those opportunities?
There are a couple of places where they are looking for guests, and so you can apply and become a part of that. I think you can subscribe, and then you put your name in the hat, and you have your own profile, and then people can find you. So there's that. But I also I reach out to podcasts that I listen to.
Okay.
I love listening to podcasts. So I'll reach out to them, and then I'll just, go through, and I'll just say, hey, I have a story to tell, and you want a copy, and let's talk. And it just kind of falls together. You just have to be present. And again, you have to be part of your community. You just can't do this in a void and sit, behind your little desk and not talk to people.
That's what authors do best.
I know. But, that screen can let you go out into the world.
The stereotypical authors out in the middle of nowhere on a coastline by themselves, which is why they get murdered often in the movies,
Yeah, I always say, the whole cabin in the woods thing is not really the writer's life, because if you don't have like conflict and, things going on in your life constantly, you have nothing to write about. I mean, you can write about the deer walking across the path in front of your window in your cabin, and that's not very interesting after 5 seconds. I mean, you got to have things to write about. So
you got to pick the haunted house. Yeah.
Yes, the haunted cabin in the woods. Now, I'm there because I do like to write fiction, and I'm really interested in speculative. So I have some spooky stuff. And
there you go.
Yeah.
Well, are there any, other than Author Event Network, do you engage in other literary events, and how do you go about finding those?
Oh, yeah, I open mics a lot for poetry, and I read a lot from this book, but I also just read other things and things that I even wrote just that day.
Is there any place locally where people could go find you?
Yeah, well, I'm going to be doing a reading in Kingston. They have a brand new bookshop called Saltwater Bookshop, and I'm doing a reading with another local, Rhonda Broach, who's also a local poet, and another woman named Nicole, who is in Lafayette, who's in Seattle, and we're all going to get together and do a reading in early January. So that's another place, and I try to do that.
That's excellent.
And it's so gratifying because this book came out during the pandemic, and there was nowhere to read it. And if you want to sell a poetry book, you have to perform it. You have to read it,
Yeah.
And so to have to do this on Zoom when everybody at that point has got total Zoom fatigue it was really hard. So I am so grateful to have live spaces to go and read from this book.
I'm aware of that bookstore. I want to go in and get to know them a little bit better myself.
It's nice.
It's been very busy this last summer with all the events we did with AEN.
Yeah, you're a busy guy.
Yeah, pretty much every weekend we're out doing something, and then in the midweek I'm trying to organize it, and then sooner or later I got to get back to my next book as well.
You got to write too.
I've got to write too. I've got a new one that I'm working on that I'm anxious to get out.
Yeah, you've got the event and you got the network. Now you got to get back to the author part.
I got to get back to the author part. Yeah. Thank you for reminding me. Do you have any other new books on the horizon?
I do. I just was, about a month ago, my short story collection, Cul-de-sac Stories, has been accepted by another regional press called Aqueduct Press. and that should come out in the spring, and that reflects some of my speculative fiction.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah,
That'll be
so
fun.
I'm super excited about that.
Are those short stories?
Those are all short stories.
Oh, excellent.
And then I'm working on a speculative novel right now. And there is a character in there who has multiple sclerosis, and I'm actually making it a point to include more characters with chronic illness, maybe generally, or who maybe are neurodivergent, which I am also, or have neurological issues or whatever, invisible illness. I just really want that to show up in all of my fiction now, just because representation matters,
And write what you know.
Right in there. Yeah.
And it does make it. All characters need flaws, and this is certainly one that is difficult to deal with. And I think you have the experience in doing that. And I think it makes the character more approachable.
Well, and it can break down stereotypes too.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's
there are
true.
lots of people who think of multiple sclerosis as someone sitting around in a wheelchair, which is true. 25% of people with multiple sclerosis are in wheelchairs or use an assistive device, but I don't. Most of my symptoms are actually literally all in my head. They're executive function things, they're speech, they're visual comprehension, that kind of thing. It's a snowflake disease. Not, no two cases are the same. That's how they describe it.
Interesting.
So I really want to use my ability to write short stories to sort of lift that veil and show people what real people living with chronic illness actually look like.
Well, I'm excited to actually see your short stories and your novel come
Me
out,
too.
because not only will it give you more books to sell in the booth, but I think it would show a broader spectrum of your creative talents that seem to be out there in abundance.
It's so fun to make books. I mean, again, I love all the design things. I love the editing. I've been an editor. I've been a developmental editor. So everything to do with publishing and creating something out of nothing.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what we do. We take a little inkling and we end up making a book out of it. People have no idea how hard that is. It is really, really hard and gratifying when you get to the end.
It is gratifying when you get it done well.
Yes, and that's chief.
The process of getting it done well is usually a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, and being willing to really be super self-critical with what you have, and throwing things out and doing it over, and writing, rewriting again, and
being willing to make lots of goofy mistakes.
And 50 versions later when you finally get it right.
That's really not that much of an exaggeration.
I've had that experience.
Okay.
Yes.
But that's it's a great process though, because you get better every time, and then your new book comes along and it's a totally different thing, and then you have to learn everything all over again.
Well, Tamara, it's always a pleasure talking with you. Thank you so much for sharing your story. It's inspirational, it's encouraging, and you're always a wonderful person to have in the booth with me.
Thanks. It's fun. It's a good time. It really is.
It's a great community.
Yeah.
And thank you for coming on Meet the Author.
Well, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Appreciate it.
Really nice to be here.
So for all of you other authors out there, if you have a story to tell, if you have a passion, if you're an accomplished author and you have a lot of books, consider Author Event Network. We're a great organization. We do events all summer long. Almost every single weekend we're basically someplace. And this is one of the benefits, is we get to find new incredible people with great stories and get to know them on a personal level. And thank you for joining us on Meet the Author. Have a good night. Goodbye.